chapter 2, then, the first thing is we see an obvious connection with what came before, right? Therefore. But when you go on to the actual statement of verse 1, it's not as obvious right away how it connects. There's clearly somewhat of a leap into a new topic or a new paragraph. So it's appropriate that they divided the chapter at this point. All right, and what comes up new here, we'll talk about how they connect, the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 in a second. But what comes up right away is this idea of passing judgment. You, the judge, in verse 1. Verse 2, we know that the judgment of God. Note the expression, we know the judgment. Verse 3, you who judge. Do you think you're going to escape the judgment of God? And it keeps going to talk about you judging. Look at verse 17, or this whole paragraph, 17 to 23, is you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and so on, and you teach others not to commit adultery. You teach them adultery is wrong, but do you commit adultery, and so on. So the whole context then moves to the idea of those who pass judgment. And that's quite different from chapter 1, where in chapter 1, the focus is on how the truth of God has been revealed from heaven. And human beings have historically, particularly pagan human beings left to themselves, have rejected the light that God has provided and have suppressed the light, have turned away from the light. You'll recall in the story of John chapter 9 when Jesus heals the blind man. And the very first thing that happens is he encounters his neighbors. And the neighbors hear the story that this is supposedly the same guy that's been blind and begging forever out in front of the temple. But he can see. But some of the neighbors say it's not him. Nope, it can't be him. Yeah, that's exactly right. They go blind. They can't see him. Of course, some can see him, and they're like, yeah, it's obviously him. But others, what's the problem? Why can't they recognize him? Because the story involves Jesus, and he has healed him on the Sabbath. And everybody knows at that stage, by that stage in John 9, everyone knows in the city that any association with Jesus means a certain excommunication from temple worship. So you can't be associated with Jesus. When the parents come in, they do everything they can to avoid saying the truth. It's not that they don't know the truth, it's that they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So, okay, Law, are you in? Yeah. All right. Anyway, oh, good morning, Steve. I didn't see you there. So these are people who then slowly, by virtue of suppressing the truth, God has built into nature, into creation, certain constraints. And those constraints are released so that people fall farther and farther down the waterfall and by cataracts and can't get back, certainly not in their own strength, until finally the mind doesn't even acknowledge the very existence of God. Now, this doesn't mean that every atheist is guilty of all the sins in chapter 1, right? Paul is describing a general trajectory. He's not particularizing and explaining every single situation for every human being.
It's not just atheists. I mean, 29 to 30, the end of this, all of those.
But those are described as, the implication is that those things erupt out of a mind that has completely rejected even acknowledging the existence of God. Yeah.
All of a sudden, you say, damn,
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Talking about these people.
That's right.
From that nature.
That's right.
As the list gets longer, I get drawn into the list. So it's kind of like.
But the force of the list is that it's a constellation. That's the force of it. And in the pagan societies of the ancient world, these things did characterize the populations. Now, what that doesn't mean, of course, is that everyone within these populations was guilty of all these sins and was completely and utterly reprobate, and they were all a homosexual or what have you. What it meant was that their attitude toward God had a direct consequence on the moral character in the society en masse. And it was a perfectly predictable trajectory. Of course, not everyone in those societies was altogether depraved and morally reprobate. It's why Dante has the part of the Inferno called limbo, right? As you get inside the gate into the first circle, you have the, so to speak, righteous pagans. You have Socrates and Virgil and Plato and people who rose above a lot of the ridiculousness of pagan society and put a lot more emphasis on the, well, for one, they believed in God in at least the classical theistic sense. And two, wrote extensive moral treatises after years of reflecting upon virtues, human virtue, human justice. What does a just society look like? And wrote things that were impressive enough to capture the attention of many a Christian right up to the present day, for good reasons. They were people who saw the problems, who thought it was absurd to make an idol and represent God that way. One of the Greek philosophers, Xenophanes, writing in 500 BC, long before Jesus, back into the days of Daniel, wrote that if the cows had gods and believed in gods, their gods would look like images of cows and would have cow attributes. Because this seems to be the nature of people. And if cows had that kind of intelligence, that's what they would do. But this is an absurdity. One shouldn't think of God like this, as if he's like a human being with hands and feet and so on. God is incorporeal, doesn't have a body. And God is one, not many. And Homer and Hesiod polluted Greek culture with their depictions of the gods. This is Xenophanes, a Greek philosopher, in 500 BC. So there were people who rose above that and passed judgment on the society around them. It seems that in chapter 2, Paul turns his attention to that kind of human being. There are human beings in the world who can see the foolishness, the wrongfulness, the damage of the society around them, and who pass judgment on it, and who believe that there really is an ultimate accountability. Socrates seemed to think so. At that we will all be judged, and that it matters the choices we make morally. It's why he chose to drink the hemlock and be executed by death, even though he knew that his trial was corrupt and unjust. He was a pagan, and he chose death over escape. His friends had come. He had wealthy friends. They provided a ship for him to escape up to Macedonia and Thessaly. He would have been happily living along the coast. It's a pretty area if you ever get there. He would have happily lived along the coast up there somewhere around Mount Athos, and enjoying his olive oil and bread while he sat along the coast there, taking a daily swim. And he rejected the escape. He had an easy escape, and he rejected it because he said, is it okay to do good always, or is it okay that we do wrong sometimes? Which is it? Which is preferable? We do good always, or we do wrong sometimes? Isn't it we do good always? That's what he said to his friends. There's a whole dialogue on it. Isn't it the case we should do good always? So, I chose freely to live in Athens. It's a free society, unique in the ancient world. I chose to live in a free society. I chose to subject myself to the laws of Athens my whole life. I'm now 70 years old. And so now the law has failed me. So do I do wrong? And compound the problem. So that my example to the rest of the Athenians is that if the society is unjust, then you be unjust. That's the lesson I'm going to teach Athens. What would happen if everybody just got to decide whenever they think the law is unjust, they get to then become unjust? What would that do to a society? Yeah. So he chose to die, knowing he could have escaped. They told him he would be a bad father. He had children. And he said, no, I'd be a worse father if I set that example. And then he raised the question, is this the only judgment we'll face? What if there's a judgment beyond this world? Socrates. So, in other words, if Paul is going to write a convincing diagnosis of the problem of sin and human guilt, he has to be a realist and understand, and of course he would know this, that there were people in the world that were not all just idol worshipers. That was true not only of Gentiles, but obviously true of Jews, even though they too had turned to idols at times. But they themselves saw the wickedness. The entire nation, by and large, saw themselves as superior to Gentiles and were in the position to pass judgment. If you ever get around to reading the Apocrypha before death, you remember some of these books were written before Jesus and provide some very interesting insights into the Jewish mindset, particularly since some of them were written very near to the birth of Jesus. The Wisdom of Solomon, as it's called, written, Maccabees for sure, in more historical books, but the Wisdom of Solomon was written in probably the 1st century BC, middle of the 1st century BC, we think, in Alexandria, Egypt, written in Greek originally. And has its entire middle section is is reminiscent of Romans 1 and 2, of how the Jews saw the Gentile, the Canaanite sins, and were themselves vastly superior to these idolatries and so on. The Jews were. So Paul is going to, in chapter 2, widen, what do they say? He's expanding the scope of his investigation. He's now reaching beyond just the vast majority of the population of humanity who are pagan idolaters, without God and without hope in the world. And turning now to that segment of humanity who saw this clearly as problematic and tried to rise above it. They could, of course, be Gentile or Jew. And so it won't be surprising that whereas at the beginning of chapter 2, he says, therefore you have no excuse, O man, it's not so clear what ethnicity he has in mind at that point, is it? Only he says, every one of you who judges. In other words, you don't give your approval, as it says at the end of chapter 1. They not only do these things, but they give approval to those who practice them. These are people who don't give their consent. They reject the behavior and the conduct and see it as flawed and wrong. But again, it seems that it is relevant. It seems meaningful. You are free to disagree. To me, that as he begins this phase of the argument, he is talking in generic terms about any man who passes judgment. He could be Cicero, Seneca, or Gamaliel himself in Jerusalem. So then what? As you move into the chapter, even though he's still talking about the same theme, he particularizes it in verse 17. But if you call yourself a Judeos, a Jew, and rely on the law, and there he's clearly addressing the Jew who passes judgment on the rest of humanity. Now, that much is just simply pointing out what's written. Some people, some commentators, some very, very sharp commentators, give many persuasive reasons for thinking that the first half of this chapter, right at the beginning of verse 1, is addressing the Jew. And that verse 16 is not, verse 17 is not a new part of the argument, but is just a continuation of the argument. As I said, they give many pretty good reasons. I think they're persuasive. Nonetheless, chapter 2, verse 1, it seems to me Paul could just as well have written, therefore you have no excuse, O you who call yourself a Jew. But that's not what he wrote. He wrote, O anthrope, O man. And then to clarify what he means by O man, he says, every one of you, all of you who judge. That seems to me, if you take him at face value, to incorporate everyone who judges. So again, there's two ways to read it. I'm inclined, but definitely not dogmatic at all, to understand his opening of chapter 2 to be a reference to all humanity, Jew or Gentile, who pass moral judgments on other humans, who see the flaws and try to rise above it. Confucius would be one of those people, wouldn't he? As well. And many, many other moral teachers in history. Impressive. And again, I'm probably I'm impacted a little bit by my classicist background because I know so many of the righteous Gentiles, righteous not in the biblical sense, but meaning they rose above their communities. And I try to make reference to them when I'm discussing these matters with non-believers, atheists, agnostics, and so on, because most people are ignorant about this. But at the same time, the wording itself seems to me to stand. So that's my position. But many really sharp commentators are convinced that all of chapter 2 is addressing the Jew. So, you know, and I think, again, there's some good arguments for that. So, there you go. More importantly is the fact that they have no excuse. In verse 1, you have no excuse. And why is that important? Because that's a reaffirmation of what was said in chapter 1 and verse 20. At the end of verse 20, it says, so that they are without a defense, an apologia. They are without an excuse. So he's laying out the case against people, not just that they're sinners, again, but that they are guilty sinners. Those are two different things, aren't they? One thing to have done something wrong. I'll never forget being in Florence, Italy, probably a decade ago, taking a bunch of students onto a bus, getting us around Florence. We went to the local market store, bought our tickets for the bus, got on the bus. It was my first time in Florence, I think. And we traveled to the other side of the city. And about 2/3 of the way there, somebody came by to check our tickets. And we're like, there they are. Yeah, we got our tickets. And they started talking to us in Italian in ways that made no sense to us. But there was clearly a problem. And finally, they got somebody who could speak English over to our group. And the little Italian I knew, I heard believe it or not, because they knew just enough English to know we were saying, we don't understand what the problem is. And the guy quoted, I'm not kidding, in Latin. He's an Italian. He quotes a Latin expression to me, not knowing I know Latin. You know what he quoted? Ignorantia legis non excusat. That much I understood. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well, they had a little machine at the front of the bus. And when you got on the bus, you had to get the ticket stamped to show when you got on the bus. Because apparently you only had like an hour or whatever of time, or maybe it's stamped to the date. I don't even remember. And so we had all the tickets and none of them were stamped. We had gotten on the bus, 5 minutes before. And so this is obviously a way for the local government to strafe tourists. And so they said it would cost 100 euros per person to get off the bus. And if we didn't get off the bus, then we'd have to go to the local police station if we didn't pay up. Yeah.
You didn't have a term to come back and say,
yeah.
I didn't pay.
There was an FBI agent in our group. And that was nice because he was able to negotiate with them. And we paid 200 euros for the group. We had a group of 20 people. And it was nice that he had all his FBI stuff. It had some leverage in that context. Aren't you glad that God, you're not going to show up in heaven? No one's going to show up in heaven, and God's going to say, "I'm sorry, but you'll have to be judged to hell." And you say, well, "What for?" Well, because you didn't believe in God, and then you did things that were wrong. Well, how would I know you existed? Oh, well, you wouldn't have. But that's not my fault. You just lived in the wrong part of the world. Well, how would I know what was wrong? Well, you didn't know what was wrong. but you're judging me for it. Yeah. Ignorantia legis non excusat. That's divine justice, is it? I don't think so. That's not what these chapters are arguing. These chapters are arguing that men knew the truth sufficiently. There is light. It's what Jesus said, didn't he? This is the judgment. That light has come, and men preferred darkness rather than the light. They loved darkness rather than the light. That's the judgment. Not they had no clue. They were in darkness. Damn them nonetheless. There's two very lengthy stories in the Gospel of John devoted to explaining the terms of judgment. John 3 and John 9. So I'll take it from the judge himself that there's no such thing in divine justice as ignorantia legis non excusat. So they have no excuse. Why? Because these people who pass judgment, in passing the judgment on another, you condemn yourself. Because you, the judge, practice the same things. Right? How many people have we heard decry the sins of their neighbor? And they are frustrated that the sins of their neighbor aren't accounted for. But the problem is, if you want, or rather they decry that God hasn't intervened right now. I hear this from many a non-believer. Why, if God is real, why doesn't he come down and save the children in, in Angola, in the Sudan? It's a question, by the way, everyone with any scent of moral integrity wonders about as well. The problem is, if you want God to come and judge the people in Sudan, then what's to stop him from coming to judge you? You want him to come and judge, do you? You sure about that? Right now you want him to judge? All sin? All wrongdoing? What is the expression? Be careful what you wish for. You might get it. So if you're passing judgment on others, by definition, you're condemned because you do the same kinds of things. Everybody does. All of us have at times judged others for the very same things that we do. It may not be to the same scale. There may even be some differentiation between what we do in our conduct and what we do in our heart of hearts. But and there are differences, by the way. Those are meaningful differences, but they are all sinful, as Jesus taught patiently and at great length through the Sermon on the Mount. That's why he warned people, don't judge. Don't be quick to judge. Because you'll have not just a little sawdust in your eye, you'll have a whole chunk of lumber sticking out of it. And yet somehow you see past it and can detect the little sawdust in your neighbor's eye. Was it James who said, don't be quick to judge? So, yeah. The judge then, in judging, will inevitably condemn himself. Out of, how did Jesus put it? Out of your own mouth, I will condemn you. Out of your own mouth. You've done my work for me. So, what's that?
Right.
Yeah. The only thing left is mercy at that point. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. You'll notice he's addressing people who agree with this. We're all in agreement that it's good that there'd be such a thing as judgment, that wrongs are accounted for, rights are praised. But do you suppose, just because you agree with God, oh man, he has another opportunity to say he's a Jew he's talking to. He says again, oh man, you who judge those who practice such things and yet do them yourselves, do you suppose that you will escape the judgment of God? Therein is the problem, isn't it? With all the hatred in the political parties, with all the judgment of the other side. Do we suppose our side will escape? Whatever our side is? Or do you presume on the, that's not, of course, to draw moral equivalence between all people. Paul's not doing that, is he? He's not saying that say a Cicero is not superior to many a Roman. In his moral conduct, in his moral judgment even. You'll recall that the Apostle Paul occasionally quotes pagan poets who offered some wise insights to their fellow Greeks. The Cretans, for one, Epimenides. He quotes in Athens. He quotes two poets while he's speaking on Mars Hill. That may have been but a sample of many poets he used and philosophers in his arguments in the marketplace and on the Areopagus. The question isn't whether they had some moral insights and even superior judgments. The question is, do they think that thereby they escape God's judgment? Do you presume on the riches of God's kindness and forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? In other words, so long as you're frustrated, I remember Bart Ehrman getting in an argument, it's a behind-the-scenes argument, off stage, about how God doesn't exist. God couldn't exist because of the children suffering in China. And he was very passionate about it. Had his voice raised. It was a moral passion. But Paul's perspective is God is there. Ehrman does not believe in God, so he's an atheist. But many moral teachers have believed at some level in God and believe there is some sort of moral accounting. And so the problem comes in, do you really think you're going to escape? And are you sure you're not just presuming upon God's long suffering and kindness toward you? As Peter wrote in 2 Peter, that God is long suffering. That's why Jesus hasn't returned yet in the context. Why hadn't Jesus returned? Why had it been so long? That's Peter writing. It only been a few decades, a couple decades. Why has it been so long, he says. And then he raises this interesting idea. It's quite an insight. He says, what if God waited 1,000 years? Would that really be a big problem before Jesus came back? Because to God, 1,000 years is but a day. I mean, the time is not really relevant. It could be thousands of years before Jesus comes back. Gentlemen, that's only a couple of decades after Jesus ascended to heaven. Aren't you glad he wrote that? That an apostle realized that it could be thousands of years before Jesus returns. That wasn't a problem. God had made a promise, and a promise he would keep. So God's kindness then, his long-suffering, why is he long-suffering? Why doesn't Jesus come back? Peter says, because he's not willing that any should perish. He's extending the deadline. And to presume upon it going on forever is to create massive problems. Because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. Verse 5. Because if you judge other people and then presume upon God's kindness that you haven't been judged yet, so therefore you're safe, or you somehow will be safe in the final judgment, then what this shows is that you're simply impenitent. Your own heart is hardened to your own sinfulness, and what that indicates about your status with God, the owner of the universe. And by not repenting and by judging others, you are just storing up wrath. Every additional judgment you render on other people is just a greater witness against you. And note that the wrath can be stored up. The idea is, the word thesavrazin is to treasure. It's an interesting use of the word. You pile it up, like the guy in the parable who says, I got to build some more barns here. I got too much stuff. And he just keeps piling up stuff. And the Lord says to him, you fool. It wasn't going to go on forever. That, of course, was a parable about wealth, not about judgment. But here the term is being used for judgment. That judgment can be increased. Wasn't Pharaoh doing a little treasuring up of wrath as he went through the plagues? And with each successive plague, his behavior, his conduct got more and more egregious. It was one thing with the first bit of evidence, but the evidence kept piling up. The light got brighter and brighter and brighter as you went from miracle to miracle. There was a point where his own magi turned to him and said, Pharaoh, don't be an idiot. Don't be an ass. This is the very finger of God. That's what they said to him. And he persisted and stored up wrath. And the light kept coming and coming and coming until it was as if he had been thrown in front of the sun itself. And then all of a sudden, the light was gone. And poignantly, the very last plague was absolute pitch darkness. So dark, says the writer, that it could be felt. So the danger, not just of passing judgment and then not realizing you're going to be judged yourself, but the danger of treasuring up judgment and wrath. So God will render, the Greek word here, if I may just say, is is the relative pronoun who. In other words, the sentence isn't quite done, even though it is in English here. Who will render? God, who will render to each one according to his works. In other words, God judges, not based on whether we pass judgment on other people and agree with God. Yep, God, these people are sinners. As if those are the terms of judgment. As long as you agree with God about judgment, you can do whatever you want. God will judge us, not according to whether we agree with his judgment or agree that there's sin in the world and that sin is bad and that people are rightfully imprisoned for their wrongness. They deserve this. It makes one feel very good, doesn't it? I mean, it has a way of making us feel safer, I guess, to say, you know, we're on God's team here, and these other people around us are such a problem to our society. And if only they weren't the way they are. So, God will judge us how? According to our works. Note the emphasis here. He will judge each one. Each individual. It's not a team thing, you know. You wrote on the, you got slivers in your backside and your team won the national championship. You were on the team. You know, you get the ring, don't you? It's not like that for judgment, for eternal judgment. You're just, you know, somehow on the team, and therefore you get the ring. Each one individually judged according to my works. Not a good thought, gentlemen. When I weigh it seriously, how can you not be repentant and humbled and have a healthy fear? A healthy fear, not an unhealthy fear, but a healthy fear that we'll be judged as individuals. You know, all of us have those moments where we do a little autopsy of our decisions, and we find that the people around us are really the problem. They're the problem. If they weren't like they are, I would be a different person. I would be free of whatever. And we're like the person who falls in off the ship and is just flailing in the water for anything to get a hold of. We have to be careful not to do it. It's not, by the way, there is some truth to it. The people around us do affect us. But be careful with that line of thinking. Let God will sort it out for us. Better to just own the whole of our sin. Now, Paul then provides a simple example to illustrate it. To those who by patience, in well-doing seek for glory and honor and incorruption or immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are seeking, self-seeking, and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness. Note, they have light, they turn away from the truth. There will be wrath and fury. Simple principle of judgment. God will honor the two categories. There will be tribulation and now he adds something in the second round. There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first, and also the Greek. That is to say, you'll note now, he's clearly factoring in the Jew. But the Jew will be first. And then the Greek. What does he mean, the Jew first and then the Greek? He means the accountability will be greater for the Jew. You'll remember when God judged Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4 for his sin. And it says 7 times passed over him. 7 times. That's what it says. 7 sevens. 7 times passed over him. Weeks is the King James, but it just means 7 times. So he was judged for 7 years. When Daniel 9 reveals the judgment through Gabriel on the city of Jerusalem, what's the time frame? 70 times 7. The Jew first, and also the Greek. I think this means will be judged in some ways with greater accountability for what we're doing here. Glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality. He will be, you won't be treated as God's blue-eyed favorite because you were a Jew or because you were American or because you were whatever. But you will be judged according to the light, nonetheless, that you had. All right, so there's some debate here. Is Paul, when Paul is describing God's judgment according to works, it sounds like he's saying, you do these good works and you're safe, right? You'll get eternal life. And if you do these bad things, then you'll get wrath and fury. And so some Christians have felt a little uncomfortable, the commentators, with Paul talking as if God's judging your works, and if you do good works, you get eternal life. If you do bad works, you don't get eternal life. You get eternal wrath. So how can Paul write that? And so some people say, well, obviously, given the rest of the letter of Romans, there's no way that Paul is schizophrenic here. I mean, he clearly knows where his argument is going. No one is righteous. They all fall short of the glory of God. There is no one who's done these good works. And therefore, people have explained this as one way to explain this paragraph is to say, Paul is saying the truth. If human beings truly were good and righteous and did these things, this is what they would get. And if they are truly bad and so on, then this is what they'll get. It just so happens no one's good. Everybody's consigned to evil. And at this stage of the argument, Paul is simply laying out the terms of how God judges, which is in chapter 1, by light, clearly, but also by conduct. That's already in chapter 1, and that carries over into chapter 2. It's both the light we had and the conduct in response to that light. I think that's a perfectly good explanation for how the argument reads. It's just the stage of the argument that he's in. Other commentators take a different view. They say, no, Paul is talking about people's actual conduct, and there will be people who can rightfully be described as patient and well-doing, seeking glory, honor, and immortality. But those are Christians. Those are the believers in God. Because a true believer in God does obey. Do they obey perfectly? No. But they clearly, as Paul will say in Romans 8, seek to fulfill the righteous demands of the law. And you'll note the expression he uses here in verse 8. He says, for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth. Do not obey the truth means they reject it. They disbelieve the truth. Not just that they're disobedient people, but they disobey the truth, which is a term he uses of belief. Remember in chapter 1, he talks about how his mission is to promote the obedience of faith. So they say, no, the language of Paul in verse 8 suggests he's thinking of those who believe God and actually conduct their lives differently from the unrighteous, versus those who disobey the truth and therefore conduct their lives unrighteously. But then some people come back and say, but that can't be the case, because there's some Christians whose lives are a wreck. And there's some non-believers whose lives look better than some Christians. So Paul couldn't possibly mean that. It couldn't be really just that by their sort of quality of their works. And then so other Christians come in and say, but that actually isn't probably the case, actually. Meaning the person who seems to be a Christian and whose life is truly more of a moral wreckage than someone else's, that's problematic. That just simply isn't the case. That couldn't be the truth. And still other Christians say, well, yes, it could, because of the stage of life and the degree of wreckage they had to begin with. And it goes round and round in circles. You can add another layer if you want to. I'm okay with all the explanations myself. They all make sense to me. The only explanation I won't accept is the suggestion that Paul is somehow forgetting where his argument is going. That is ridiculous. So however we try to understand the paragraph, if you want to understand it as him referring specifically to Christians versus non-Christians, I'm totally fine with that. I don't have any major objection to it. I myself kind of lean toward the stage of the argument thing. I have an illustration I'm going to give you as we close, which is that when I first started working on my cars in the early matrimonial years with no money, and I knew nothing about cars, but my car would break down and I was like, well, I got to fix the thing because I can't pay anybody to fix it. So I bought one of these books, I can't think of I used Hanson's, weren't they? Wasn't that one of them? Anyway, you know what I'm talking about, the real thick manuals. It's been so long. I've now used YouTube for 10 years, so I've forgotten the name of the books. But I had a whole library. Whatever car I had, I bought these thick books. And I would go into the book, and it would say how to replace whatever, an alternator, or maybe a fuel pump. And so what would happen is they'd have these instructions, and they'd have some pictures on the side, and you'd look at the pictures and read the instructions, and you just kind of figure out what the fuel pump looks like and what you're supposed to do. So then I'd go pop the hood of the trunk, and I'd look down at my car, and it looked nothing like the picture. Why? Because they had removed the alternator and removed the air filter and all the, they'd taken the battery out, and for the picture, to get a picture of it, they removed a whole bunch of stuff. So when you looked at their picture, it wasn't really your car unless you removed all that stuff too. And not everything had to be removed. They just removed it so you could get a good picture of it. You could kind of you could get your elbow and wrist around in there with the right kind of tool. You could still get a ratchet down in there, certain kind of ratchets, and you could get it out, the bolts off. But so in other words, they had created essentially a car that didn't actually exist or run anywhere. So you would understand how to fix the car. Paul, I think, does this at numerous points, not just here. I think he does it at numerous points of Romans. It's a really important thing when you get to Romans 6. I'll come back to this analogy. That he's laying out the stages of the argument so far as the argument runs. And you have to sort of get through the whole argument before you see all the pieces. In other words, he's sort of pulling a few pieces out of the car so you can see only one thing right now. So that's my own sort of understanding of it and reading of it. But you don't have to accept that. Guys, I just saw I have literally 1% on my computer